So in this lesson, we're going to look at the question of, is demand endless? And this is an interesting question for consumers because we are always consuming goods, but there's always this question of, are we going to just consume the same thing over and over and over and over again? Do we get satisfied? What happens? So that's kind of where we are in this lesson, is to answer that question. So let's begin. Look at this question of endless demand. So demand for goods and services is not endless, okay? There is a limit. Each consumer has a point at which they are satisfied. So the limit for every single consumer is the point at which they're satisfied. That is our limit. That is the point at which we say, okay, demand is no longer endless for goods and services. Now those points do vary from consumer to consumer though. And so each consumer has their own individual demand schedule. Remember, you saw this in the last unit, looking at the law of demand, and as the price of goods increases, your quantity demand decreases. That is your individual demand schedule. And each consumer has one of these based on this concept of demand not being endless. And so the combination of all consumer demand schedules creates what is known as market demand. And in our next lesson, that's what we're really going to begin to start graphing out. So as consumers consume goods and services, they become satisfied. And then that satisfaction is called utility in economics. So when we refer to the term utility, what we're referring to is the satisfaction gained from the consumption of goods. So let's look at this term utility. So utility is the satisfaction that a person gets from the consumption of a good or service. So it is our satisfaction. In economics, the term is used to describe the preferences of consumers and explain the quantities of goods that people choose to buy. So utility tells us what we're buying from our preferences and then how much. So that's what utility is describing. So we take our preferences, what we want to buy, and we add to that the quantity, how much are we going to purchase of that good, and then that gets us utility, which also equals satisfaction. So our satisfaction is based on what good we're buying and how much of it we're buying. So your preferences indicate which goods you want to buy, which brands, and then the quantity of those combined creates your utility or your satisfaction. Okay, so let's look a little more detail here on utility. So we want to use this term utility to begin with, and we're looking at total utility, which is the total benefit that a person receives from a good or service. As we consume goods, we increase our total utility. There's a small problem with that though, and it's what we call marginal utility. As we're increasing our consumption, we could attach a number to it, and so that number is going to increase because our total benefit increases as we're consuming. However, marginal utility tells us that as we increase consumption, our total utility is going to increase, but at a smaller and smaller rate. So marginal utility is thus the change in total utility that results from a 1 unit increase in the quantity of a good consumed. So let's break that down a little bit closer. So it's the change in total utility results from a 1 unit increase in the quantity of a good consumed. What it tells us is this: even though total utility is going to increase as we consume, it does so at a smaller and smaller rate. So maybe it goes from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. So when we look over here at figure 3.11 at total utility and marginal utility, we see what's happening. Notice that total utility increases from 0 to 46, but marginal utility goes down each time. So 15, 10, 7, 6, 5, 3. So as we increase the quantity of books we read per day, our total utility increases, but our marginal utility decreases. In other words, this tells us how quickly we're becoming satisfied. And you can kind of think about it as if you were eating chocolates. So if I give you a piece of chocolate, you're satisfied, or you're not. Maybe you want another piece. So then you eat that one. So then I offer you a third and you eat that one. Well, maybe at piece number 4, you're not really interested in having another piece of chocolate. That would tell us then that we've reached your satisfaction level. We're done. And that's really what this is telling us. So let's look at this from a graphical perspective. So you see this red line here with the dots. Those dots represent what we just looked at. And that line, of course, is just intersecting through them. So the red line shows the marginal utility of the chart in figure 3.11, which is what we just looked at. With what you'll notice here, these yellow blocks showing the increases in total utility. So notice with each 1 unit increase in consumption, total utility rises, but the marginal utility diminishes. And we can see that because notice that the yellow blocks get smaller and smaller and smaller. So if we take those same blocks and we put them over here to the right, and we say units of utility, then what we notice, of course, is that when we stack it side by side, as you can see, it decreases the quantity of books consumed, increases by 1 unit. So here's the total utility stacked side by side. You can see that it decreases as the quantity of books consumed increases by 1 unit. So as we consume books, notice the total utility begins to decrease. And that leads us to what's called the law of diminishing marginal utility. So here's the law. So as a person increases consumption of a product while keeping consumption of other products constant, so we're only talking about a single item here, there is a decline in the marginal utility that the person derives from consuming each additional unit of the product. So when we view it like this and we look at this, one of the things we can do is we can throw this line in here. And what you'll notice, of course, is we see that we reach a peak and then it begins to decline. So what we do is we basically, in economy, this is an upside down U, but really what it's telling us and what this section of the curve itself is telling us is that it's explaining why we get sick from eating too much or why study cram sessions are not at all helpful. And the reason why is because as you increase consumption and you continue to consume and consume and consume, eventually you reach the peak, you reach your consumption level. If you move past that consumption level, notice it has a negative effect. In other words, you can eat too much food, it will have a negative effect on you. You can study too much, it will have a negative effect on you. There is an optimal point, in other words, to which you should do anything. You can look at it from a sports perspective pretty easily. There's an optimal amount of practice time. If you go beyond the optimal amount of practice time, you automatically begin to increase the risk of injury because it's having a negative effect on the athletes. So there's always an optimal, but there's also not enough. You go too far to the right on this curve, you're not doing enough. You go too far, so you go one side to the other. So over here on the left, we're not doing enough. We reach the middle, we're at optimal, that's perfect. If we go past that line, then we begin to see the negative effects of it. So utility is one of these things that we work with within demand that gives you an idea of what people are purchasing. And you kind of think about it from a movie theater perspective. There's a reason why movies don't stay in theaters forever. Because as you continue to watch them, the number of people who have already seen the movie increase, the number of people who would see the movie continue to decrease, therefore profits are decreasing. So that's what this marginal utility begins to tell us.